Louis Hine was a master of photography and one of the most important social activists of his time. He used his art to expose the tragedy of child labor and to get rights for those too weak to fight for their own. It was his deep compassion for his subjects and his moral drive that made his photographs so impactful and motivated Americans to seek a change. Without his work, child labor would have continued for many more years, risking the welfare of children nationwide. Hine took it as his responsibility to right a terrible wrong, and his work proved to be a powerful weapon against child labor.
Every morning just at 5, the whistle blew on time and called them babies out of bed at the age of 8 and 9.
Louis Hine was born in Oshkosh, Wisconsin on September 26, 1874. Hine's first experience with the harsh conditions of labor came firsthand when his father died the year he graduated from high school, leaving him to support his family. He took a job at the local furniture factory where he worked 13 hours a day, 6 days a week, and for only $4 in weekly wages until the furniture factory went out of business when Oshkosh was hit by an economic panic in 1893. Hine then found odd jobs elsewhere until he decided to continue his education and teaching in 1900. When Frank Manny, a friend of Hine's, was offered the job of superintendent at the New York Ethnic Culture School, Manny took Hine along as a teacher. It was here where Hine discovered photography. Manny wanted to integrate photography into the classrooms and utilize it as a teaching tool, and Hine, who had no prior knowledge of photography, picked up a $10 box camera for the first time. In 1904, the two of them decided to photograph incoming immigrants at Ellis Island to put a face on a concept they were teaching their students. With Manny as his assistant, Hine would take families away from the crowd and have them stay long enough for him to take the photograph. He continued taking photographs at Ellis Island for 3 years, marking his progression from amateur photographer to master. In 1907, Hine's photography career took off as he took investigative photographer assignments from the Child Welfare League, National Consumers League, and for the National Child Labor Committee. Child labor was a prevalent problem at this time in American history. The Industrial Revolution had brought with it many new factories that needed employees. Children of all ages were working long hours at dangerous jobs in factories that were better suited for adults. They were hired because they had no demands, they were too intimidated to complain, and their labor was much cheaper than the general wages. Industries hired hundreds of these tiny workers, and by 1900, 1.75 million children were employed nationwide. The laws at the time were rarely enforced, so industries constantly found loopholes that allowed children who were barely the age of 5 to work. Papers were forged to make children older than they were, and few of them were educated. Children were paid much less than adult workers, and this resulted in general wages dropping for all, making it increasingly more difficult to support families. The majority of the population in America at this time was either unaware of the magnitude of this issue or chose to ignore it. This is where Hine came in. He would use his photography to expose these situations, and the leagues would publish them, giving America a first look at these conditions. Like other activists in the progressive movement, Hine wanted to do whatever he could to make a change.
What the progressives and Hine and other people of their generation thought, and they're really the first generation that thinks this way, is that children have a right to a clean and safe environment, a good home life, the right to play and explore and develop, and particularly the right to an education. The fight against child labor in a lot of ways was the fight for all of those rights.
In 1908, Hine was offered a full-time investigative photographer position by the National Child Labor Committee, or otherwise known as the NCLC. The NCLC was founded in April 1904 by Edgar Murphy and Robert Hunter, and it was a private nonprofit organization whose mission was promoting the rights, awareness, dignity, well-being, and education of children as they relate to work and working. Their goal was to get stricter laws on child labor regarding working ages and school attendance. From 1908 to 1917, Hine traveled the country searching for children who were being exploited. It wasn't very hard to find. In nearly every state he found evidence of child labor. Hine investigated textile, glass, and tobacco factories, canneries, coal mines, industrial farms, and many more businesses that were using child workers. The most well-known child labor work of Hine's came from the mines of Pennsylvania in 1910. Here he photographed breaker boys doing some of the most dangerous jobs in America. The most common job for these boys was sitting over a conveyor belt called a breaker for hours at a time and picking out slate from the coal. Here, Hine investigated a case where a 10-year-old fell to his death off the breaker. Hine found that his papers were forged to say that he was 14. Along with the dangers of the job, the conditions in which the boys worked in were deadly. Coal dust was constantly hanging in the air, and the boys' lungs were full of it. This commonly resulted in black lung disease. These photographs appeared on propaganda created by Hine for the NCLC. It wasn't always easy to get the photographs he wanted, though. Between carrying 50 pounds of equipment and avoiding legal trouble, Hine had his work cut out for him. Factory owners didn't want America to see the kinds of conditions their employees were working in, so Hine had to disguise his intentions. He commonly would pose as a fire inspector, salesperson, industrial photographer, or whatever else would allow him access to the work floor. He would post children next to monstrous equipment, saying that he merely wanted to get a sense of scale when really he was getting the photographs he needed. Hine also believed that authenticity was of the utmost importance. He knew the height of each button on his coat to the floor, and he could measure the children simply by standing next to them. He also showed the children great care, allowing them to open up to him about their lives. Hine recorded every last detail in a small notepad hidden in his pocket and used that information to put as much credibility to his photos as possible. His personal belief was that the descriptions were just as important as the photos to convince America that there needed to be a change. One thing the majority of his photos have in common are that the subjects are looking straight into the camera. Hine specifically had the children do this because he wanted to capture the reality of the situation. He believed that their eyes and faces could tell their story even better than he could. Things didn't go so smoothly all the time, though. Occasionally the police were called to escort him off the premises. Hine would then resort to other tactics such as taking photos from afar, waiting till the manager was out to lunch, and even photographing the workers as they came in and out of work. Hine was relentless in his mission, and through one way or another he got his photographs. Not only did Hine work as an investigative photographer, he also spoke at conventions and turned his photographs into propaganda for the NCLC. His photographs appeared in lectures, newspapers, and posters. Hine wanted to see America change, and he did everything in his power to do so. During his entire time as an investigative photographer for the NCLC, he traveled over 100,000 miles and took over 7,000 photos. His photos certainly had an impact, and America was finally seeing the terrible situations these children were in. One of the many results from Hine's photographs was the federal government created the Children's Bureau sponsored by President Taft in 1912. This bureau was made to investigate all matters pertaining to the welfare of children and child life among all classes of our people, and it became a part of the U.S. Department of Labor in 1913 with Julia Lathrop as its chief. Now that America could see for themselves the conditions these children were working in, a change became necessary. Bills were created to regulate child labor, but they rarely got far due to pressure from businesses and overstepping federal jurisdiction. The first federal child labor law was created in 1916 and was called the Keaton-Owen Act. This act banned the selling of products from companies that used child labor. The bill was passed by Congress and signed by President Wilson, but the Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutional. Similarly, in 1920, an amendment was proposed that would give Congress a power to regulate child labor, but due to lack of government support, it never came into fruition. Although America finally wanted to change, it would take a few more years for one to stick. But when it did, it would change America completely. After quitting his NCLC job in 1917 due to a drop in his salary, Hine found few photography assignments. He struggled to make ends meet with only a few major jobs such as photographing World War I relief efforts and the construction of the Empire State Building. In 1939, Hine lost his house due to financial difficulties and his wife passed away. The next year, on November 3rd, Hine passed away and all of his prints and negatives went to his only son, Corydon. Louis Hine was a catalyst for many changes in child labor laws and rights. These laws help protect children even today. He took it as his responsibility to show America how truly horrible labor conditions were for children, and this sparked many changes. It was because of his photographs and the attention they were getting that the Federal Children's Bureau started, and many acts such as the Keaton-Owen Act were considered. Although it took many years for a law to pass and stick, America could no longer ignore this issue. States such as Pennsylvania were enforcing new and stricter laws after Hine visited, and in 1911, the NCLC reported that 30 states had risen the minimum age of workers. Still, the Supreme Court was ruling every act that had to do with child labor unconstitutional until finally in 1939, the first lasting federal child labor law was put into place called the Fair Labor Standards Act. This act put an age requirement on workers and restricted certain jobs deemed too dangerous for children, and it is still in place today. Hine had finally seen his visions come into fruition. Children were now getting the rights they deserved. Even before this law, Hine's work was having an impact. Half the amount of children were working from the time he started in 1908 to when he finished in 1917. Louis Hine's work captured the innocence that America had taken for granted and made it everyone's responsibility to protect the rights of those too young to secure their own.
Every time I close my eyes, I see that picture still. When textile work was carried on with babies in the mill.